My daughter thought love was a service you could order over the phone, like a taxi. She didn't understand that a father's inheritance is not a birthright, but a privilege that must be earned. She laughed at my request for help in the most vulnerable moment of my life. And I, the architect, simply took the blueprints of her future and redrew them all. She was expecting an inheritance. Instead, she got a notice from a lawyer. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. The hospital had been a world of measured, predictable pain. A white, sterile environment where my suffering was managed by charts, schedules, and the quiet hiss of an IV drip. They called the surgery a success, a routine hip replacement. The surgeon, a man half my age with the confident hands of a master craftsman, had shown me the X-rays, pointing out the clean lines of the titanium implant. He spoke of it as an elegant piece of engineering. As an architect, I could appreciate that. My name is George Matheson. I am 76 years old, and for 50 of those years, I designed buildings. I understood structures, stress loads, and the importance of a sound foundation. But as the orderly wheeled me out of the hospital into the blinding afternoon sun, I understood with a terrifying clarity that the foundation of my own life had just been revealed to be made of sand. The pain in my hip, a deep grinding ache that radiated down my leg, was nothing compared to the wound that had been inflicted an hour earlier, over the phone. The memory of the call played on a loop in my mind, a sharp, ugly echo in the quiet of the medical transport van. I had asked the nurse for a moment of privacy, my heart thudding with a nervous rhythm the monitors would have flagged as irregular. It took a supreme effort to ask for help. I had spent my life being the provider, the designer, the man with the plan. Vulnerability felt like a foreign country, and I was a reluctant tourist. I had dialed her number, my daughter, Evelyn. I had explained that the doctor was discharging me, that I was heading home. I described the hospital bed that had been delivered to my living room, the walkers, the array of prescriptions. And then I had made my request, my voice thin and reedy, a stranger's voice. I asked if she would stay with me. Just for one night. Not to be a nurse, but just to be there. A presence in the house. A safeguard against the unknown terrors of the first night of helplessness. The silence on the other end of the line was followed by a sound that shattered something deep inside me. It was her laugh. Not a cruel laugh, which might have been easier to bear, but a light, airy, dismissive laugh, thin and sharp as shattered glass. It was the laugh of someone for whom my request was not a plea from a father in pain, but a ridiculous, theatrical imposition. I could hear the faint clinking of glasses in the background, the murmur of other voices. She was out, at a restaurant or a cocktail party, living her life. "Oh, Dad," she had said, the laughter still in her voice. "Don't be so dramatic. That's what services are for. Just call a nurse." And with that, the transaction was complete. My request for love had been reclassified as a request for labor, a task to be outsourced. She had hung up, leaving me in a silence far more profound than the one that had existed before I called. The transport attendants helped me into the house, their movements efficient and impersonal. They navigated my oversized body through the doorway I had designed to be wide and welcoming, and settled me into the cold, crisp sheets of the hospital bed. It sat in the middle of my living room like a sarcophagus, a monument to my own decay. This room, my greatest design achievement, with its vaulted ceiling and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the old oak trees in the yard, had been planned as a gathering place for family. Now, it was my sick room. After they left, the silence they left behind was absolute. The sun began its slow descent, and the light in the room shifted from bright and clinical to long, mournful shadows. The house, my creation, began to conspire against me. The familiar comforting groans of the structure settling now sounded like mocking sighs. The acoustics, which I had designed to carry the sound of laughter and conversation, now amplified the sound of my own shallow, pained breathing. Pain is a lonely continent. That night, I was its sole inhabitant. The throbbing in my hip was a relentless drumbeat, but the true agony was the echo of that laugh. Call a nurse. The words suggested a simple, practical solution, but what I heard was a brutal translation. Your need is an inconvenience. Your vulnerability is a burden. You are no longer my father. You are a problem to be managed. I stared at the framed blueprints hanging on the opposite wall, the original drawings for this very house. Every line, every measurement had been made with love, with the vision of a family growing within these walls. I had designed a home, but I had failed to design a family that understood what a home meant. As darkness consumed the room, leaving me with only the faint glow of a street lamp outside, a cold, hard clarity began to crystallize within me, pushing aside the grief. An architect, when faced with a catastrophic structural failure, does not weep over the flawed design. He assesses the damage, condemns the unsound structure, and begins to draw up a new set of plans. The pain was still white-hot, but for the first time, I felt the faintest glimmer of a new foundation taking shape beneath the rubble. The morning did not bring relief. It brought a harsh, unforgiving clarity. I awoke from a series of short, pain-filled dozes to a room that was already bright with sunlight. The light, which I had so carefully designed these windows to welcome, now felt like an accusation, a spotlight on my utter helplessness. My body was a prison of pain. The surgical site in my hip throbbed with a deep, percussive rhythm, a constant reminder of the violation of steel and screw. My sheets were twisted and damp with a feverish sweat. A thick, metallic taste, the residue of the night's pain medication, coated my tongue. For a long moment, I simply lay there, a fallen monument in the center of my own living room, taking inventory of my new, diminished reality. My first battle of the day was the simple act of taking my morning pills. They were in a small plastic cup on the bedside table, next to a glass of water that was now empty. The table was positioned just a few inches too far away for an easy reach. It was a minor miscalculation, the kind of small detail that in my professional life would have been corrected on the blueprints long before construction. In my current state, it was a chasm. The effort to twist my torso, to stretch my arm without jostling the searing agony in my hip, took all of my concentration. My muscles screamed in protest. I finally managed to knock the cup closer with my fingertips, the rattle of the pills on the wood sounding like a gunshot in the silent house. I dry swallowed them, the chalky bitterness scraping down my throat, but the need for water was now a desperate, primal urge. The kitchen was a world away. The journey from the bed to the kitchen sink, a distance of no more than 30 feet, was the most arduous expedition of my life. The process of getting out of the bed was a slow, agonizing negotiation with gravity and pain. I used my arms to push my torso upright, a wave of dizziness washing over me, the room tilting on its axis. I swung my good leg to the floor, then, with a deep, shuddering breath, I eased the repaired leg over the side. It felt like a foreign object, a dead weight of concrete and wire attached to my body. I reached for the aluminum walker the hospital had provided. Its cold metallic touch offered no comfort, only a utilitarian promise of support. Gripping the handles, I pushed myself to my feet. The pain that shot up from my hip was a white-hot flash, and I had to pause, my head bowed, waiting for the wave of nausea to pass. Then, I began my trek. Each step was a carefully considered act. Lift the walker, move it forward 6 inches, then shuffle my feet to catch up. The plush oriental rug, which for decades had been a landscape of soft comfort, was now a treacherous terrain. its edges threatening to catch the legs of the walker. The corner of the heavy oak coffee table I had chosen for its solid, permanent feel was now a dangerous promontory I had to navigate around. I, George Matheson, who had once walked the high steel skeletons of skyscrapers, was now reduced to a shuffling, trembling creature. My world shrunk to the few feet of floor space visible between the bars of my walker. When I finally reached the kitchen, I was drenched in sweat and breathing heavily, as if I had just climbed a mountain. I leaned against the cool granite of the countertop, my strength utterly spent, and it was there that my eyes fell upon the photograph. It sat on the counter by the toaster, where Clara had always kept it. A faded snapshot from a summer picnic nearly 30 years ago. In it, Clara was laughing, her head thrown back, her smile so wide and genuine it seemed to light up the whole frame. In her arms was a small, gap-toothed Evelyn, her face buried in her mother's neck in a hug of pure, uncomplicated love. The image was a perfect architectural rendering of what I thought I had built, a structure of unconditional support, a home founded on love. I stared at that photograph, at the ghost of that perfect memory, and the sound of my daughter's laughter from the night before, so different, so brittle and dismissive, crashed into it. The two realities collided in my mind, the loving past and the callous present, and in that collision, the entire edifice of my life's work collapsed. The grief was a physical blow, a sudden hollowing emptiness that was worse than the surgical pain. But then, something else rose in its place. It was a feeling I knew well. It was the cold, dispassionate clarity that comes when an architect inspects a building after an earthquake and sees a fatal, irreparable crack running through the foundation. The design was flawed. The materials were not what I had believed them to be. There could be no repairs. There could be no patching of the cracks. The entire structure was compromised and had to be condemned. The pain was still there, a deep, throbbing ache in my body and my soul, but it was no longer the central feature. It was now just data, a piece of the final damage report. My hand, shaking not from weakness but from a sudden, grim purpose, reached for the phone on the wall. I slowly, deliberately, punched in the numbers for my lawyer, Mr. Davies. I was not calling him for sympathy. I was calling him to commission a demolition. I stood in the cold, morning silence of my kitchen, one hand gripping the edge of the granite countertop, the other holding the telephone receiver. The photograph of Clara and a young, smiling Evelyn seemed to watch me, a faded ghost from a life that was no longer mine. The journey from the living room had left me breathless, my entire body humming with a low-frequency pain. But inside my mind, a profound and unnerving calm had settled. The emotional earthquake was over. The shockwaves of grief and humiliation had subsided. Now I was the architect in the aftermath, standing amidst the rubble of a collapsed structure, my mind already working, assessing, and planning the demolition. There was no more room for sorrow. There was only the work to be done. My first order of business was to call the foreman, the man who would help me bring the condemned building down. My old, leather-bound address book was in the drawer of the telephone stand. I pulled it out, its pages soft and worn with age, and flipped through the tabs. The book was a small cemetery of its own, filled with the names and numbers of friends and colleagues, many of whom were now gone. I found the entry I was looking for, written in my own hand, years ago. Davies, Arthur, Esk. Mr. Davies was a man of my generation, a lawyer who understood that a man's word was a contract, and a handshake was a foundation. For over 30 years, he had been the careful legal custodian of my life's work, drafting the documents that I believed were building a permanent, unshakable future for my daughter. He had no idea he was about to be given the order to dismantle it all. I punched in the numbers, the small plastic buttons clicking with a sharp finality. The phone rang 3 times on the other end, each tone a small eternity. I half expected a secretary to answer, but then his voice came on the line, familiar and steady. The voice of the frail, recovering patient vanished, replaced by the voice I used to use on construction sites when addressing a contractor who was behind schedule. It was the voice of George Matheson, the architect, the man in charge. "Arthur," I said, using his first name to signal the gravity of the instruction. "I need you to listen very carefully. Effective immediately, I want you to suspend all activity related to my existing estate plan. Freeze the current will. Place a hold on any and all powers of attorney, both medical and financial, that name my daughter, Evelyn Matheson, as my representative." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. I could picture him in his office, a room of dark wood and leather-bound books, his pen frozen over a legal pad. He had spent his career as the careful guardian of a single, consistent directive: everything for Evelyn. This instruction was a seismic event, a reversal of 30 years of planning. He cleared his throat. I could hear the confusion in the sound. He started to ask a question, his voice hesitant, but I cut him off again, my words precise and deliberate. "There has been a fundamental change in the project's design parameters," I said, falling back on the language that was as natural to me as breathing. "The foundation has proven to be unsound. The structural integrity has been catastrophically compromised." I let the words sink in, the cold professional metaphor of far more powerful explanation than any emotional confession could ever be. "We are not renovating, Arthur. We are not reinforcing. We are proceeding with a complete demolition. I want you to prepare the necessary paperwork, to liquidate, to clear the site. We will be redesigning from the ground up, starting with a bare foundation." He was quiet for another long moment, processing the finality of my words. He was a smart man. He understood the subtext. He did not ask what Evelyn had done. He did not pry into the personal disaster that had precipitated this professional directive. He simply shifted from the role of concerned friend to that of legal counsel. His voice, when he spoke again, was all business. He told me he understood that he would put an immediate hold on all documents as instructed, and that he would begin preparing a full accounting of all assets for my review. He was ready to receive the new blueprints. After I hung up the phone, placing the receiver back in its cradle with a quiet, definitive click, I leaned heavily against the wall. A wave of profound exhaustion washed over me, the adrenaline of the moment receding, leaving the raw, physical pain in its place. But beneath the pain, there was a new feeling, a feeling of control. I was no longer the victim of my daughter's casual cruelty, a helpless old man lying in a bed. I was the client. I was the architect. I had surveyed the wreckage, and I had just given the first order for the new construction to begin. I looked around my home, at the silent walls and empty rooms. It was no longer a monument to a failed past. It was now simply a site, a plot of land waiting for a new, better structure to be built upon it. After the call to my lawyer, a deceptive calm settled over me. I had set in motion the demolition of my old life, but the practical realities of my physical prison remained. I was still a helpless man in a hospital bed, marooned in the center of my own living room. The grim irony of my situation was not lost on me. To begin the work of building my new independent future, I first had to follow my daughter's cold, dismissive advice. I had to call a nurse. The act itself felt like a surrender, a final capitulation to the humiliating terms she had dictated. I found a home care agency through a search on my laptop, the process as impersonal as ordering groceries online. I described my needs in a flat, detached voice to a stranger on the phone, a checklist of my own infirmities. A service was being procured. A transaction was being made. There was no pretense of love or duty, only the clean, simple language of an hourly rate. The nurse was scheduled to arrive the following morning. I spent the intervening hours in a state of quiet dread. I was an intensely private man. My home, my sanctuary, had already been violated by this bed, by my own body's betrayal. The thought of a stranger entering this space, of her hands tending to my most private needs, of her witnessing my weakness, was a source of profound discomfort. It felt like a final stripping away of my dignity. I expected someone young, cheerful, and professionally detached, someone whose bright energy would only serve to highlight my own decay. I steeled myself for the performance of being a grateful, uncomplaining patient. Her name was Rosa. She arrived precisely on time, a woman I guessed to be in her early 60s, not much younger than myself. She was not what I had expected. There was a quiet, settled gravity about her. Her hair was pulled back in a simple, neat bun, and her eyes, framed by a web of fine lines, were calm and observant. They were the eyes of someone who had seen a great deal of suffering and was no longer startled by it. Her movements were economical and sure. Her hands, though worn, were steady. She introduced herself in a soft voice, her presence not an intrusion, but a quiet, calming addition to the still room. She did not fuss. She simply began to work. She moved through my house with a silent competence that, as an architect who valued function and design, I found myself admiring. She read the doctor's instructions, organized my medications on the bedside table, and checked the dressing on my incision with a touch that was both professional and surprisingly gentle. She prepared a simple lunch for me, a bowl of soup and some toast, and she did not try to fill the silence with meaningless chatter. She understood, it seemed, that my condition was not a topic for polite conversation. Her presence was a service, yes, but it was a service delivered with a deep, unspoken respect for the dignity of the man she was caring for. As the day wore on, my mind became a split screen. On one side, I observed the quiet, efficient reality of Rosa's care. On the other, I saw the ghost of my daughter's absence. When Rosa helped me stand and take a few agonizing steps with the walker, her steadying hand on my back was a firm, reliable support. I contrasted it with the phantom of Evelyn's arm, an arm that was not there. When Rosa brought me a fresh glass of water without my having to ask, I remembered the parched, desperate thirst of my first night alone. Every small act of Rosa's paid, professional kindness was a stark, damning indictment of my own child's filial failure. The most profound realization came in the late afternoon. I was trying to read, but the book was heavy, and my tired hands let it slip. It fell to the floor, landing just out of reach. In my old life, I would have simply bent down and picked it up. Now it might as well have been on the moon. A wave of frustration and pure, pathetic helplessness washed over me. I stared at the book, a small, insurmountable challenge. I did not say a word. Rosa, who had been tidying up on the other side of the room, noticed the direction of my gaze. She walked over, bent down without a word, picked up the book, and placed it on the table beside me, within easy reach. She gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod, and then returned to her work. In that tiny, silent gesture, the entire emotional architecture of my life shifted. Rosa, a stranger, had seen my need and met it, unasked. My daughter, my own flesh and blood, had been explicitly told of my need and had laughed. Evelyn had defined our relationship in her final, brutal words. "Call a nurse." She had reframed a father's plea for love into a client's request for a service. And as I looked at the quiet, competent woman across the room, I understood the profound, liberating truth of the worldview she had given me. She was right. Care was a service that could be bought, and I had bought it. It was excellent. And in this new, transactional world she had created, a legacy was not a right. It was not a debt of love owed to a child. It was a payment, and it had to be earned. Her laughter had been her invoice, submitted for services not rendered. And in the quiet of my living room, I, the client, had made my decision. Payment would be denied. A week after my initial call, Mr. Davies was scheduled to visit. The morning was charged with a grim, purposeful energy. I was still confined to the hospital bed, a helpless monarch reigning over a kingdom of pillows and blankets in the center of my living room, but my mind was a flurry of activity. I was preparing for the most important meeting of my life. I had Rosa, my quiet and efficient nurse, help me into a clean, pressed shirt. It was a small, perhaps pathetic, attempt to reclaim a sliver of my former self, to not feel entirely like a patient. I was about to give the orders to tear down a structure 50 years in the building. I felt I should at least look like the architect in charge, even if my body had been reduced to a fragile ruin. From my bed, I watched the clock on the mantelpiece, each tick a steady, methodical countdown to the beginning of the end. I saw him through the large window, walking up the stone path I had designed myself 3 decades ago. Arthur Davies was a man who seemed impervious to the passage of time, his posture as upright and his suit as impeccably tailored as they had been on the day we first met. He carried a heavy, worn leather briefcase that I knew contained the collected legal architecture of my entire life. Rosa let him in, and he entered the living room with a quiet gravity, his professional gaze taking in the scene, me, the hospital bed, the walkers, without a flicker of surprise or pity. His expression was one of solemn, professional respect. He nodded to me, then set his briefcase on the heavy oak coffee table, its latches clicking open with a sound that seemed to seal the room in a bubble of serious intent. The space between my bed and the sofa was transformed from a living room into a boardroom. The coffee table, a surface that had held countless cups of coffee, children's books, and family photo albums, now became the site of a systematic deconstruction. Mr. Davies began to unload the contents of his briefcase, and with each file he placed on the polished wood, a piece of my past was laid out for final inspection. He did not rush. His movements were as deliberate and finally, he brought out the financial portfolios, a series of thick binders and folders detailing the stocks, bonds, and mutual funds I had so carefully cultivated over a lifetime of work and disciplined saving. This was the raw material, the steel and concrete and timber I had stockpiled to build the cathedral of my daughter's future. I watched as he arranged the files in a neat, orderly grid, and I felt a cold, professional calm settle over me. I was no longer a father looking at the inheritance intended for his child. I was the chief architect reviewing the blueprints for a massive, complex project, who has just been informed of a fatal, foundational flaw discovered in the final stages of construction. The design, so lovingly rendered, was worthless. The structure, so close to completion, was a teardown. The pain of this knowledge was a low, constant ache beneath the surface, but my focus was entirely on the task at hand. There was no room for sentiment. There was only the professional necessity of a controlled demolition. Mr. Davies sat on the sofa, his hands resting on the files, and waited for my instructions. His silence was a professional courtesy, a space he created for me to fill. I took a breath, the air in the room feeling heavy, thick with the unsaid history contained in the papers between us. "Arthur," I began, my voice quiet but steady, stripped of all emotion. "I want you to conduct a full structural survey. I want a complete inventory and a current market valuation of every single asset laid out on this table." I gestured with my hand toward the files, a king on his deathbed, commanding the dissolution of his own kingdom. Every account, every share, every deed. I need a complete bill of materials. We are not renovating a room. We are not making additions. We are razing the entire structure to the ground. The site is to be cleared. I looked him directly in the eye, ensuring he understood the finality of my decision. We are starting again, from a clean slate. The report from Mr. Davies arrived 3 days later, not as a simple email, but as a heavy, courier-delivered parcel. It was a thick, formally bound document, its sheer physical weight a testament to the life contained within its pages. Rosa signed for it on my behalf and placed it on the adjustable table that swung over my bed. For a long moment, I simply stared at its plain, unassuming cover. It was the complete architectural survey I had requested, the final blueprint of the life I had built with Clara, now rendered in the cold, dispassionate language of finance. I felt a tremor of hesitation, the last ghost of the man I used to be, a father who saw these assets as a fortress for his daughter. I silenced it. I was no longer the original architect reviewing his beloved creation. I was the demolition expert, studying the plans to find the most efficient way to bring the structure down. I spent the next several days immersed in that document. My world shrank to the confines of my bed, the pages of the report, and the quiet, unobtrusive presence of Rosa moving through the house. The report was my sole companion, a grim ledger of my life's work. It was organized with Davy's characteristic precision into sections: real property, equities and bonds, cash and equivalents. As I read, I performed a strange and painful act of mental surgery upon myself, meticulously dissecting every asset from the warm, living tissue of memory that surrounded it, leaving only the cold, hard fact of its market value. The first section was the house I was lying in. The report listed its specifications as if it were any other property in a portfolio. Single-family residence, 4-bed, 3.5 bath, 3,800 skifthors, 0.5-acre landscaped lot. It noted the updated kitchen, the new roof, the assessed value, and the estimated current market price. As I read those sterile details, my mind overlaid them with a different set of specifications. I saw the line item for the great room Wastkas vaulted ceiling, and I remembered standing on the subfloor with a young Clara, sketching the curve of the ceiling on a piece of scrap plywood, trying to explain how it would catch the morning light. I saw the landscaped lot, and I remembered the day I planted the great oak tree in the front yard, with a 5-year-old Evelyn helping, by filling the hole with her tiny plastic bucket, her face smeared with mud. Every beam, every window, every brick held a memory. I forced myself to push them away. I had to see the house as Davies now saw it, not as a home, but as a highly liquid real estate asset, the primary source of capital for the project to come. Next was the lake cabin. The report described it clinically. Recreational property, waterfront, 2-bed, 1-bath, W. Cockatast private dock. The valuation was robust, driven by the recent demand for vacation homes, but the number on the page was a pale ghost compared to the rich, vibrant value it held in my memory. Reading the words private dock, I was transported back in time. I felt the rough, sun-warmed wood under my bare feet. I smelled the faint, fishy scent of the lake and the sharp, clean fragrance of the pine trees. I heard the echo of a child's squeal as I taught Evelyn how to cast a line, her small hands struggling with the oversized fishing rod. I remembered the nights we spent on that dock, wrapped in blankets, watching meteor showers streak across the vast, dark sky. The cabin was not a building. It was a repository of the best moments of my fatherhood. A cold wave of sorrow washed over me, the last rebellion of my heart. I took a deep breath, turned the page, and reduced 30 summers of my life to a number in the asset column. The largest section was the financial portfolio, pages and pages of tables and charts detailing the stocks and bonds I had spent a lifetime accumulating. It was a carefully constructed portfolio, built on the same principles I used in my architecture. A solid foundation of blue-chip industrials, diversified with forward-looking technology stocks, all of it designed for steady, long-term growth. Each holding had been chosen with Evelyn's future in mind. I had bought into companies that built things, cars, airplanes, infrastructure, because I believed in the tangible world. I had invested in medicine and technology because I wanted her to have a stake in the world of tomorrow. The portfolio was not just a collection of investments. It was a statement of my philosophy, my hopes for her. Now I reviewed it with the cold, detached eye of a fund manager. I was no longer a father providing for a daughter. I was a fiduciary, analyzing assets for their liquidity and suitability for the new mission. The sentimental reasons for each purchase were now irrelevant. The only question that mattered was how quickly and efficiently each could be converted to cash. After 3 days, I reached the final page. At the bottom, in bold, was the total net worth. It was a substantial number, the final sum of a lifetime of labor, of careful planning, of love. A number that had once been the source of my deepest pride, a symbol of the security I could provide for my family. I looked at it now, and I felt nothing. The number had been stripped of all its emotional meaning. It was no longer an inheritance. It was not a legacy for a daughter. It was simply a budget, the working capital for my final and now greatest architectural endeavor. For several days after I finished my review of Mr. Davies' report, I existed in a strange and silent limbo. The demolition was complete, at least in my mind. The emotional structures that had defined my life, my home as a family sanctuary, my savings as a daughter's inheritance, had been intellectually razed to the ground. I was left with the final, stark number at the bottom of the ledger, the total sum of my net worth. It was a vast, formidable resource, a cleared site ready for a new project. But for the first time in my life as an architect, I had no blueprint. The cold, motivating fury that had propelled me through the initial phase of my plan had receded, leaving a hollow, echoing void in its place. An act of negation, I was discovering, is not a purpose. It is a vacuum. I spent the long, quiet hours in my hospital bed, contemplating the nature of destruction. I could, with a few simple instructions to Davies, ensure that my entire fortune would be consumed by taxes and legal fees, a final bitter bonfire of my life's work, leaving nothing for anyone. I could establish a simple annuity for myself and arrange for the remainder to be absorbed by the state upon my death, vanishing into the great, indifferent machinery of government. These were options, valid and legally sound. They were scorched earth policies that would guarantee Evelyn received nothing. But as I turned these possibilities over in my mind, they brought me no satisfaction. They were blueprints for nothing. They were acts of pure spite, and there is no elegance, no lasting structure in spite. An architect abhors a void, and these plans were nothing but voids of varying sizes. To end my life's work with an act of pure erasure felt like a betrayal, not of Evelyn, but of myself, and of the fundamental principles by which I had lived. The catalyst for change came not from a legal document or a financial statement, but from the same faded photograph on the kitchen counter that had triggered my initial decision. During one of her quiet, efficient circuits of the house, Rosa had noticed it, and, with a small, thoughtful gesture, had moved it to the bedside table where I could see it more clearly. I looked at the image of my wife, Clara, her face radiant with a joy so pure it seemed to defy the passage of time. And as I looked at her, I moved past the pain of her absence and began to remember the substance of her presence. Clara had been the soul of my architecture. I designed the structures, the strong bones and logical layouts, but she was the one who filled them with warmth, with life, with humanity. She was the one who organized neighborhood gatherings, who volunteered at the library, who believed in the limitless potential of people. A legacy of pure, sterile destruction would have been anathema to her. To simply erase everything I had built would be to dishonor the spirit of the woman who had helped me build it. It was then, staring at her smiling face, that the idea arrived. It came not as a shout, but as a quiet, certain whisper, as clear and true as a perfectly drawn line on a fresh sheet of drafting paper. I was an architect. I did not destroy. I built. And the greatest honor I could pay to my wife's memory was not to tear down the old world, but to build a new one in her name. The concept settled into my mind with the force of a foundational truth. The Clara Matheson Foundation. It was a structure, a new design, a project worthy of my final years. The emptiness I had been feeling was instantly filled with a surge of creative, purposeful energy, a feeling I had not known since my retirement. The cleared sight of my fortune now had a blueprint. My mind, the architect's mind, began to work with a speed and clarity that belied my broken body. I saw the structure of the foundation with perfect, three-dimensional clarity. The initial capital, the sum of my liquidated life, would be its deep and unshakable foundation. The mission would be its central pillar. It would support young, aspiring architects. It would find talented students from backgrounds of poverty and hardship, the kinds of brilliant, hungry minds that the world so often overlooks, and provide them with the resources to pursue their education. I was not just creating a charity. I was designing a system to create more creators. My legacy would not be a static, finite inheritance passed to one person. It would be a dynamic, self-replicating structure, a legacy that would multiply with every building my scholarship recipients went on to design, with every community they went on to shape. The foundation would be a living thing, a testament to the idea that the purpose of building is not to enrich oneself, but to shelter and inspire others. With my hands trembling slightly, not from weakness but from excitement, I reached for the phone to call Mr. Davies. The tone of this call would be entirely different from the last. The first had been a cold, hard directive to demolish. This was a commission to build. I was no longer a client seeking to punish. I was the lead architect, unveiling my vision for a new, grand design. I would create a structure that Evelyn could never touch, but more importantly, I would create a structure that she could never comprehend. It would be built not of spite, but of purpose. It would be a monument not to my anger, but to Clara's enduring love. The creation of the Clara Matheson Foundation became the sole, all-consuming focus of my existence. The hospital bed in my living room was no longer a symbol of my confinement. It transformed into my design studio, my drafting table, the central hub from which I would architect my final and most important project. The initial incandescent flash of the idea from the day before now had to be translated into a workable blueprint, a set of plans as rigorous and detailed as any I had ever drawn for a physical structure. The excitement was a powerful analgesic, a creative fire that burned away the persistent, nagging pain in my hip. I asked Rosa to bring me my old drafting tools from the study, my favorite clutch pencil, a set of precise rulers, and a thick pad of heavy cream-colored vellum. I could not stand at a drafting table, but I could still think, I could still design, I could still build. My first task was to define the core philosophy of the foundation, its structural and moral cornerstone. Why scholarships for architects? The answer was rooted deep in my own past, in a story I had not shared with anyone in years, not even with Clara. I had not been born to a life of comfort. My own father was a steelworker, a man whose hands were calloused and whose body was worn down by the furnace. We had lived in a small, cramped house where privacy was a luxury. But from my earliest memories, I was a builder. I built castles from mud and sticks, futuristic cities from scrap lumber. My talent was the only real asset I possessed. It was a high school art teacher who saw that raw talent and a local civic scholarship, a small, almost forgotten fund established by some long-dead industrialist that gave me the chance to leave my factory town and attend a university. That scholarship was the foundation upon which my entire life had been built. My legacy could not be a simple monument of accumulated wealth. It had to be a bridge, like the one that had been extended to me, a structure that allowed others to cross the same chasm of circumstance that I once faced. With this core principle established, I began to draft the specifications of the scholarship program itself. This would be no simple tuition check. I was designing a complete support structure. I remembered the gnawing anxiety of my own student years, the constant worry about rent, the cost of books and drafting supplies, the meals I had skipped. My foundation would eliminate all of that. The Clara Matheson Scholarship would be a comprehensive award, covering not just full tuition, but also room and board, all required supplies, and a generous living stipend. I wanted my scholars to be free, to be completely immersed in their creative work, their minds untroubled by the demeaning and exhausting realities of poverty. Their only job would be to learn, to dream, and to design. The selection criteria would be equally unique. I drafted a mission statement for the selection committee that would one day be formed. They were to look beyond mere academic transcripts. They were to search for a spark, for a raw, untamed creativity in an applicant's portfolio. More importantly, they were to read the applicant's essay, a statement of purpose, which would ask one simple question: what kind of world do you want to build? I was not interested in funding the next generation of corporate architects who would design sterile glass towers for the wealthy. I was looking for the dreamers, the humanists, the young people who wanted to design community centers, sustainable housing, public libraries, and hospitals. I was designing a legacy that valued purpose over profit, a structure that would shelter and serve, not just impress. My old architectural metaphors became the framework for my thoughts. The foundation's endowment, the sum total of my life's work, was the deep, concrete caisson, sunk to bedrock, unmovable. The legal charter that Mr. Davies was drafting was the steel skeleton, the rigid framework that would give the structure its shape and strength. The board of directors I would eventually appoint would be the trusses and load-bearing walls, tasked with maintaining the integrity of the original design. And the scholars, year after year, they were the true purpose of the building. They were not its occupants. They were its spires, each one reaching for the sky, each one a testament to the strength of the foundation beneath them. I spent days on this work, filling pages with notes, diagrams, and flowcharts, designing a system that was both generous and rigorous, a structure built to last for centuries. During this intense period of creation, my daughter, Evelyn, became a ghost, a faded preliminary sketch of a life I had once planned to build. The old blueprint, the one that had her at its center, seemed like the work of another man, a naive architect who had failed to properly survey the ground upon which he was building. That structure had been designed to be a passive inheritance, a beautiful but static monument to be consumed. This new design was active, generative. It was a power station, designed to energize and illuminate countless other lives for generations to come. I had not just changed the beneficiary of my will, I had fundamentally redesigned the very definition and purpose of my legacy. With the blueprints for the Clara Matheson Foundation complete, the project moved from the conceptual design phase into active construction. The energy in my living room turned sick room shifted. The quiet, contemplative work of planning was replaced by the dynamic, forward-moving process of execution. I was no longer just the architect of an idea. I was the general contractor, directing the complex logistics of a major build. My days became a whirlwind of secure phone calls, encrypted emails, and the review of legal and financial documents. The pain in my hip remained a constant, unwelcome companion, but it was relegated to the background, the dull, predictable noise of a generator running on a busy construction site. The work itself was the main event. Mr. Davies returned the following week, his heavy briefcase now filled not with the relics of my past, but with the tools to build my future. I presented him with my handwritten notes, the detailed architectural program for the foundation I had painstakingly drafted. He sat on the sofa, the same sofa where my daughter would never sit again, and read through my pages with the intense focus of a building inspector reviewing a set of master plans. I watched his face as he absorbed the scope of my vision, the specific mission, the detailed criteria for the scholarships, the mentorship component, the very philosophy of building builders. When he was finished, he looked up from my notes, and for the first time, I saw in his professional, lawyerly eyes a look of genuine, profound admiration. He told me it was the most well-conceived and meaningful philanthropic endeavor he had ever had the privilege of being involved with. His validation was the first seal of approval on my new design. From that point on, we began the legal construction. Davies outlined the process: the filing of articles of incorporation to establish the foundation as a legal nonprofit entity, the drafting of the bylaws that would serve as its permanent operating manual, the application to the IRS for tax-exempt status. Each step was a complex, time-consuming task, but to me, it was all part of the build. The legal jargon, the dense paragraphs of the charter, this was the building code we had to follow. The fees for filing were the costs for the building permits. Every document Davies sent for my review, I read with an architect's eye for detail, ensuring that the legal language perfectly captured the spirit of my design. Simultaneously, I began the financial construction, the funding of the endowment. This required another series of calls to my broker, David. My tone was entirely different now. There was no feigned weakness in my voice, no talk of simplifying my affairs. My instructions were clear, direct, and aggressive. I was no longer a cautious retiree seeking to preserve capital. I was a founder capitalizing a major new enterprise. I directed him to begin a systematic liquidation of specific holdings. The blue-chip industrial stocks, the tangible, reliable assets that had mirrored my old worldview, were the first to go. Their value was stable, their sale providing the initial solid bedrock for the foundation's endowment. The process of selling was a strange, disembodied experience. Lying in my bed, with the quiet assistance of Rosa, I could move millions of dollars with a few quiet words over the phone. I was a ghost in the vast, complex machine of the market. With each sale, I felt a small, satisfying thrill, not of destruction, but of transformation. I was taking the dormant, passive energy of my accumulated wealth and converting it into active, kinetic energy. I was melting down the steel of my old life to pour the foundation for the new one. The trade confirmations would arrive by courier, and Rosa would help me open them. I would look at the numbers, the sums being transferred to the new holding account for the foundation, and I would feel the quiet, profound satisfaction of a project moving forward, on schedule, and under budget. During this time, I thought of Evelyn, but the thoughts were fleeting and distant. I pictured her living her life in the city, attending her parties, making her business deals, completely oblivious to the tectonic shifts occurring in the financial landscape that she had always taken for granted. The ground beneath her future was being systematically excavated and removed, and she had no idea. There was no malice in this thought, only a sense of grim, architectural finality. In any great design, the architect must make choices about what is included and what is excluded. By her own actions, by her own laughter, she had excluded herself from the project. I was simply formalizing her decision in the bylaws and the balance sheets. She was no longer a structural element of my legacy. She was, at best, a curious passerby who might one day wonder about the beautiful new building being constructed on a site she once thought was hers. With the legal and financial machinery for the foundation now in motion, Mr. Davies brought the next phase of the project to my living room headquarters: the disposition of the real property. The stocks and bonds had been impersonal, numbers on a page that could be moved and liquidated with a clean, surgical precision. The properties, the actual physical structures I had designed and inhabited, were another matter entirely. They were the containers of my life, their walls saturated with the memories and emotions of half a century. To dismantle them felt less like a financial transaction and more like an excavation of my own heart. The decision about the house I was in, my primary residence, was the easier of the two, though not without a deep and lingering sadness. As Davies laid out the appraisal documents, the glossy photographs of my own home made it look like a stranger's. The report was glowing, praising the excellent architectural details and strong structural integrity. I felt a flicker of the old professional pride, immediately followed by the bitter irony that the structural integrity of the house was impeccable, while the integrity of the family it was built for had proven to be rotten to the core. Selling it was a logical necessity. It was far too large for my new, diminished life, and its considerable value was required to form the main pillar of the foundation's endowment. I gave the instruction to list it for sale with a cool detachment. Its purpose as my family's home was over. Now its purpose was to serve as raw material for the new structure I was building. But the lake cabin was different. When Davies placed the file for the cabin on the table, a wave of visceral, crippling nostalgia washed over me. This was not just a recreational property. It was a sacred site. It was a simple, rustic structure I had designed and helped build with my own hands one long, hot summer when I was a young man. It was made of cedar and stone, designed to blend into the pine forest that surrounded it, to be a quiet retreat from the noise of the world. As I looked at the deed, I was not in my hospital bed. I was there. I could smell the damp, earthy fragrance of the woods after a thunderstorm. I could hear the rhythmic lapping of the lake water against the old wooden dock. I could feel the rough texture of the fieldstone fireplace, a fireplace where I had taught a little girl with bright, curious eyes how to toast a perfect marshmallow. The memories were a torrent. I remembered Clara, her face illuminated by lantern light, reading a book in the old wicker armchair on the screened-in porch. I remembered Evelyn's frantic, joyful shrieks as she jumped off the dock into the cold lake for the first time. I remembered quiet, solitary mornings, watching the mist rise off the water, a cup of coffee steaming in my hands, feeling a sense of peace so profound, it felt permanent. That cabin was the architectural embodiment of my family's happiness. To sell it to strangers, to imagine them sleeping in our beds and fishing off our dock, felt like a desecration. To allow it to eventually pass to Evelyn, the person who had so thoroughly devalued the very love that had built it, was simply unthinkable. I was trapped. It was the most difficult design problem I had ever faced. For days, I was paralyzed by this dilemma. I could not bring myself to give Davies the order to sell. The cabin was the last, most significant piece of my shared life with Clara, and I could not bear to let it go. But I could not keep it. It was a project with no future, a beautiful structure with a compromised purpose. I spent hours on my laptop, not looking at financial data, but searching for a third way, an elegant solution that would honor the past while serving the noble purpose of my new future. I researched land trusts, historical societies, and arts retreats, but nothing felt right. The answer came to me late one night. I stumbled upon an article about a small, highly regarded charity that focused on providing therapeutic recreational experiences for the families of military veterans who had been severely wounded in combat. They had programs that allowed these families, shattered by the trauma of war and the grueling reality of recovery, to spend a quiet week together in a peaceful, natural setting, to reconnect and begin to heal. The article was accompanied by a photograph of a young soldier with a prosthetic leg, his arm around his wife, watching his small daughter skip stones across a lake. Their faces were etched with hardship, but in their eyes there was a glimmer of hope. In that moment, I knew. I saw the perfect, final blueprint for the lake cabin. I saw a way to save it by giving it away. These people, these families, understood the meaning of words that had been rendered hollow in my own life. Duty, sacrifice, support, and unbreakable bonds. The cabin, which I had built as a sanctuary for my own family, would now become a sanctuary for heroes and their families. Its purpose would not be erased, but elevated. The sound of children's laughter would still echo off the dock, but it would be the laughter of children whose parents had paid a profound price for their country. The warmth of the fireplace would still comfort weary souls, but they would be the souls of men and women who truly understood the meaning of coming home. The next morning, I called Mr. Davies. My voice was clear and strong, filled with a sense of rightness and peace that had been absent for days. I told him to halt any plans to appraise or list the lake property. "I have a new designation for it," I said. "Draft the deed of gift. We are donating it, in its entirety, to the Wounded Veterans Family Retreat Program." There was a respectful silence on the other end of the line. The solution was elegant. It was final. I had not demolished the most beautiful part of my past. I had repurposed it, giving it a new and far more noble function than I had ever dreamed possible. The following weeks were a blur of meticulous legal construction. My physical strength slowly returned, a mirror to the growing solidity of the new life plan I was building. The hospital bed was finally removed from my living room, an act that felt like the striking of a film set, the end of a long and painful scene. I graduated from the walker to a cane, and with each new tentative step I took through the rooms of my home, I felt a piece of my old autonomy returning. The house was no longer a prison or a sick room. It was simply a space, a structure I would soon be leaving behind. The true construction was happening on paper, in the quiet, methodical exchange of documents between my home and Mr. Davies' office. Finally, the day came when he called to inform me that the final documents were ready for my signature. It was a formidable collection: the newly drafted will, the official charter and bylaws for the Clara Matheson Foundation, and the deeds of gift for the real estate properties. He sent a full set to me by courier for a final review. I spent 2 full days with them, seated in my own armchair for the first time in months, a pot of fresh coffee on the table beside me. It was the final, most crucial inspection of the project. I read every word with the focused intensity of an architect conducting a final walkthrough, checking every joint, every seam, every structural specification to ensure the entire edifice was flawless. The legal language was dense, but I saw in it a kind of stark, functional beauty. It was the language of permanence, of rules and structures designed to withstand the erosion of time and the assaults of greed. Then I came to the clause in the new will that pertained to my daughter. It was brief, brutally simple, and perfectly engineered. It stated, with cold, legal precision, that the sum of $1 was to be bequeathed to Evelyn Matheson. Davies had explained the grim necessity of it. It was not an act of spite, but a legal firewall. The nominal bequest proved that she had not been forgotten or accidentally omitted, thereby neutralizing any future claim that the will was the product of a failing or forgetful mind. It was a single necessary brick in the massive wall I was constructing. I read the words, $1, and felt not a shred of triumph, only a deep, hollow ache of finality. It was the precise, calculated market value of a daughter's love. It was the invoice for her laughter. The day I chose for the signing was a clear, cool autumn afternoon. For the first time since my surgery, I dressed myself completely, knotting my own tie, my fingers slow, but steady. It was an act of profound significance, a reclaiming of my own personhood. I was not a patient being taken to an appointment. I was the founder and chairman of a new philanthropic enterprise, on his way to execute its foundational documents. I walked, with the help of my cane, out to my own car in the garage. The simple act of sliding behind the wheel, of feeling the familiar leather, of starting the engine, was a declaration of my own quiet, hard-won independence. The drive to New Hope was a contemplative journey. I was not the same man who had made these trips before. I was no longer a client seeking help, nor a man burning with a cold rage. I was simply an architect on his way to sign off on a completed project. When I entered Mr. Davies' office, the atmosphere was one of quiet solemnity. The complete set of documents was laid out on his conference table, a formidable stack of paper that represented the total and complete redesign of my life. A notary public and 2 of his staff members were present to act as witnesses. They greeted me with a respectful deference. I sat at the head of the table. Mr. Davies gestured to the first page. I uncapped my own pen, a heavy silver fountain pen I had used for decades to sign off on my architectural drawings. This was to be the last, and most important, blueprint I would ever approve. I began to sign. My hand was perfectly steady. Page after page, my signature flowed onto the paper, a simple familiar mark that was now redirecting the entire flow of my life's work. I signed the will, with its cold $1 clause. I signed the charter that breathed legal life into the Clara Matheson Foundation. I signed the deeds that gifted my home and my lakeside sanctuary to their new, more worthy purposes. Each signature was a quiet, deliberate act of creation. With each one, I felt the weight of the past 50 years being transformed, reconfigured from a private, failed legacy into a public, hopeful one. When the last page was signed and the notary's seal was embossed upon it with a heavy, satisfying thud, the work was done. The structure was complete. It was sound. It was permanent. I had built my final and best building. The final act of the demolition was not mine to perform. The construction of my new legacy was complete, the documents signed, the legal framework permanently in place. All that remained was the notification, the final, quiet severing of the last tie. It was a task I had delegated to Mr. Davies. My war had been a silent one, and its conclusion would be no different. The climax of my story would not be a fiery confrontation, but a phone call I would not be on, a conversation I would not hear. It would be a distant, controlled explosion, the results of which would be reported back to me with professional detachment. I had given him the instruction. He was to call Evelyn at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the following Tuesday, a time when I knew she would be in the middle of her busy workday, a time when her guard would be down. On that Tuesday, a strange and profound calm settled over me. I spent the day in quiet solitude in my now uncluttered home. The process of packing had begun, and the rooms were slowly being stripped of their personality, becoming the neutral architectural spaces I had first designed them to be. I sat in my armchair by the window, a book open but unread on my lap, and watched the slow, unhurried rhythm of the autumn day. I felt no nervousness, no anticipation, no vengeful glee. I felt only the quiet, focused patience of an architect on demolition day, standing at a safe distance, waiting for the foreman to push the plunger. The design for the new building was already complete. This final act was merely a necessary clearing of the site. As the clock on the mantel ticked towards 3, I allowed myself to visualize the scene. I pictured Evelyn in her sleek, minimalist office high above the city, a place I had only seen in photographs. She would be in command, directing her staff, making decisions, her world a perfect, orderly structure of ambition and success. Her phone would chime, and she would see the name of my lawyer, a name she knew well, a name she associated with the smooth, inevitable transfer of my fortune into her own. I imagined her answering the call with a hint of impatience in her voice, expecting a routine update, a minor detail to be approved. She would have no idea that the call was not an update, but a wrecking ball, aimed squarely at the foundations of the future she had so confidently assumed was hers. Mr. Davies called me at 3:10. His voice was the same as always, a dry, steady baritone, utterly devoid of emotion or drama. He was the perfect instrument for this task. He informed me, in the precise language of a legal report, that the instruction had been carried out. He had reached my daughter at her office. He had informed her, as a professional courtesy to a party named in a now superseded legal document, that I had recently executed a new will and testament and had simultaneously established a major philanthropic foundation. He had stated, as a point of fact, that this new foundation was now the primary beneficiary of my estate, and that all her previous appointments, including her roles as executor and as my power of attorney, had been legally and permanently revoked. He then described her reaction, not with interpretive language, but by simply reporting the data of the conversation. First, he said, there had been a silence on the other end of the line. A silence so long and so complete that he had felt it necessary to ask if she was still there. After another few seconds, her voice had returned, but it was, he reported, unrecognizable from the smooth, confident tone he was used to. It was sharp, high-pitched, and incredulous. A torrent of questions had followed. What foundation? What was its purpose? Who was on the board? On whose advice had I done this? She had questioned my mental state, demanded to know the name of my doctor, and insisted on speaking with me immediately. To all of this, Mr. Davies had responded calmly that he was not at liberty to discuss the specifics. The call was a notification, not a consultation. He had informed her that any further inquiries would have to be directed to him in writing, preferably through her own legal counsel. And then he had politely ended the call. As I listened to his dispassionate account, I searched within myself for a reaction. I waited for a surge of triumph, a feeling of vindictive satisfaction, a sense of a victory won. But there was nothing. The angry, wounded man who had collapsed in his kitchen months ago was gone. Her shock, her anger, her disbelief, it all felt like news from a foreign country, a place that no longer had any relevance to me. Her reaction was simply the sound of the old, flawed structure collapsing, a distant rumble of dust and broken steel. It was the predictable and necessary outcome of a well-designed plan. My work was not in her reaction, but in the new structure I had built, the beautiful, strong, and permanent edifice of the Clara Matheson Foundation. I thanked Mr. Davies for his impeccable professionalism and hung up the phone. I looked out the window. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the lawn. The demolition was complete. The site was clear. I was, for the first time in a very long time, completely and utterly at peace. 6 months passed. The seasons turned, carrying me away from the frozen, painful winter of my recovery, and into the tentative, hopeful light of a new spring. My body, like the world outside my window, began its slow, arduous process of rebuilding. The agonizing work of physical therapy, the daily battles with weight and resistance, slowly yielded results. The walker was relegated to a closet, a metallic skeleton of a past vulnerability. The cane followed, eventually leaning in a corner, more a security blanket than a necessity. I learned to walk again, my gait forever changed, a slight rolling limp a permanent reminder of the wound that had started it all. But with each independent step, I felt the foundations of my own life being restored, not as they were, but as something new, something leaner and stronger. The house sold quickly. The process of emptying it of 50 years of my life was not the heartbreaking ordeal I might have once imagined. It was a liberation. With Rosa's quiet help, I sorted through the accumulated layers of my past. I was not a sentimental archaeologist. I was a decisive architect clearing a site. I kept a few essential things: a small box of Clara's letters, my favorite worn armchair, my old drafting tools, and the photograph of the smiling mother and child that had become the catalyst for my new world. Everything else, the heavy furniture, the sets of china, the countless objects that had once felt so essential, was sold or donated. I watched the movers carry it all away, piece by piece, and I felt not a pang of loss, but a sense of immense, unburdening relief. I was stripping my life down to its essential structural elements. There were attempts at contact from the world I had disowned. A series of voicemails appeared on my answering machine. I listened to them once. The first was from Evelyn, her voice a sharp, incredulous staccato of anger and accusations. The next, a few days later, was pleading, laced with a false, saccharine sorrow. The last was a rambling, manipulative monologue. I listened to them all with the detached interest of an engineer listening to a recording of a building collapsing, a predictable sequence of stress and failure. Then, I deleted them. A few weeks later, a thick, registered letter arrived. I recognized her handwriting on the envelope. I held it in my hand for a moment, this last, desperate attempt to breach the walls of my new life. I did not open it. I walked to the small shredder in my new study and fed the letter into it, watching as my daughter's words were transformed into a meaningless pile of confetti. My new home was an apartment on the 15th floor of a modern building downtown, a clean, minimalist space of glass and steel. It was the antithesis of the sprawling family home I had left behind. It was a space designed for one person, for a future, not a past. I arranged my few possessions with care, creating a new, simpler life for myself. From my balcony, I could see the entire city spread out before me, a vast, intricate blueprint of human endeavor. I felt a part of it again, not as a builder of its great structures, but as a quiet observer, a man who had finally put his own small, complicated structure in perfect order. The Clara Matheson Foundation came to life. I attended the first board meeting via a video call, my face a small, quiet square on a screen of esteemed colleagues and professionals I had appointed. I listened as they discussed the first round of scholarship applications, my heart swelling with a quiet, paternal pride. The system I had designed on paper, from my sickbed, was now a living, breathing reality. The machine was working. The true culmination of my victory, however, arrived not in a legal document or a financial statement, but in a simple, hand-addressed envelope. It was the first letter from the first recipient of the Clara Matheson Scholarship. I opened it with hands that trembled slightly, not from age, but from a profound, hopeful anticipation. The letter was from a young woman in Oregon. She wrote of growing up in a trailer park, of a childhood spent sketching fantastical buildings on the back of diner placemats. She wrote of her dream to become an architect, a dream she knew was impossible, a luxury her world could not afford. She wrote of the moment she received the notification of the scholarship, a moment of disbelief so overwhelming she had to read the letter 5 times before the tears came. She did not just thank me for the money. She thanked me for believing in a future she had not dared to believe in for herself. She ended the letter by describing the kind of architect she wanted to be, someone who would design beautiful, dignified, and affordable housing for families like the one she had come from. I held her letter, the thin paper a sacred artifact, and the tears that had been absent throughout my entire ordeal finally came. They were not tears of sorrow or of anger. They were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. This letter, this young woman's dream, this was the first beautiful and perfect structure built upon my new foundation. I had lost a daughter, but I had gained a generation of builders. I looked out my window at the city skyline, a forest of steel and glass, and I felt a profound sense of peace. I had spent my life designing buildings. I finally understood that a true legacy is not a structure of stone and steel that you leave behind for one person. It is a foundation of hope that you build for many.